Welcome to Advantage. I'm your host, David Young, and today we're going to let the sun shine in on our podcast. It's summer, which is a great time to reflect, recharge, and rejuvenate. And let's face it, we need to learn how to do those things all year long, not just during breaks or the summer. Working in education, leading, and serving others is so rewarding. And I believe for most of us, it's a calling. It's something that we're innately wired to do, and it's something that gives us a purpose in our life. And when you do your life's work and make a living within a position that is so geared toward helping young people shape their lives into something better than they would have been otherwise, we have to consider that a blessing. However, like many things in life, the greatest things can also be the hardest things. So consider this: things like iPhones, social media, etc., are some of the greatest things ever to happen to society. It would be hard to argue that those haven't come with tremendous positives. But I think we could also argue that they may be some of the worst things ever to happen to society. As I get older, I notice that dichotomy more and more. Often the best things can also be the worst things. To avoid this, I think we have to be consciously aware of both the positives and the negatives of the things that we do and have access to. And we need to have the tools that we need to navigate those in a positive and healthy way. So let's talk about education. What's the negative side of being in the field of education? And more specifically, what are the negatives of being an educational leader? Well, it is a blessing to be tasked with shaping young people's lives and leading those in our charge to do the same. But that responsibility is also a heavy, heavy weight to carry. As a result, we experience burnout, frustration, and sometimes depression. We bring the job home with us. I know we all can probably, that probably resonates with all of us. We can also tend, if we don't watch, to neglect our own families and even ourselves in an effort to do the job at a really high level. So how do we harness the good of this blessing that we have in education while we also manage the bad? My guest today is Kim Strobel. Kim is a nationally known keynote speaker, consultant, and educational thought leader, among many other things. She has vast experience in areas like growth mindset, reimagining education, overcoming adversity, embracing personal and professional well-being, and many others. On today's episode, I've asked her to speak on a topic that, number one, she's passionate about and so knowledgeable about, and number two, a topic that I believe we all in education need to hear more about. Kim is deeply entrenched in what she calls the science of happiness. Kim travels all over the country speaking, coaching, and training educators on happiness, how it's more than just a feeling, how it can have a profound impact on your performance, and how we can actually reprogram our brains to be more positive and find happiness in our everyday lives. It's not just about, quote, willing ourselves to be more happy. There's actually a science behind living a happier life. I believe that it's 100% a message that we need to hear, and I'm excited to have Kim on the podcast today. So with that, Kim Strobel, thank you for joining me on Advantage today.
Oh, thank you, David. It's my honor to be here with you.
So, Kim, I've given our listeners a little bit of background on you. What else can you share with our listeners to help them get to know you a little bit better? And that could be personal and or professional.
Yeah, well, I started my career in fourth grade. And then from there, I became a literacy coordinator for grades K through 12. And then from there, I became a curriculum director. So felt like that was a great opportunity to really be able to lead teachers. And then I had this crazy idea and decided in 2015 that I would launch my education consulting business full-time come January 2016. And so we started out doing a lot of day-long professional development on trainings that really empowered the teachers in the classrooms working with the students. And that has now evolved all these years later to where I do most of the motivational speaking piece now in the education world and in the corporate world. And then I have a couple of dynamo gals that go out in the field and are deeply entrenched in classrooms yet. And so that's the fast and furious. I think it's also important to know because I was speaking down in Texas last week to 2,500 school leaders, and many times I get introduced as this, like a happiness coach. And I feel like 80% of people hate me before I even come out from behind the curtain. It's like, what is this going to be like? Some sunshine sprinkled and butterfly type of woman. But I actually share my story of how I became immersed in the science of happiness. And I won't go into all the detail of it, but I do tell this story on the stage because I think it's important to understand that while I can, live this big life and travel across the country and work with phenomenal people, as you probably know, sometimes it's the hardest things in our life that kind of lead us to our mission in life. And so I always tell people that I had this moment last week. I was on the rooftop of my hotel looking out over the city of Austin, and I thought to myself, never in a million years did I think that this would be my life, because I had a very debilitating anxiety disorder that probably started as a child, but back then we didn't know anything about anxiety disorders. And so I went on functioning pretty normally. My parents obviously knew that I had some issues, but it all really escalated. And then my sophomore year of high school, I was sitting in my English language arts class, and I tell people that just within like 1 second, it was just the most tremendous terror that I've ever felt in my life. I felt like the walls were closing in. I felt like I didn't know my name. I didn't know where I was. Things looked dreamlike, like feelings of unreality. My whole body was sweating, and I can go on and on and on and talk about that. But the bottom line is, from age 16 till about age 24, my life became extremely small. I struggled to do the simplest of things. I mean, I quit college because my only safe place was at my parents' house. I struggled to do things like drive 5 minutes to work, drive 5 minutes to Walmart, go in the Walmart. All of those things were incredibly hard. And so I kind of had this fire inside of me of the real Kim Strobel. And then there was these limitations that prevented me from living the life that I wanted to live. And I didn't know what was wrong with me. And so I always tell people, you might not understand what a panic attack is like. And that's what I eventually got diagnosed with at age 24. Because it's really hard for the logical person to understand this. But I always say, if I were to put you, David, on a train track, and that train was coming at you at 300 miles per hour, and I told you that that train was going to stop 1 inch before it hits your face, I just for a second want you to imagine the feeling of what that would feel like. Because somebody like me feels like that all day long. But the problem is there's no train and there's no danger, which means your brain can't attach why you're feeling that way. So then you feel crazy, and then you feel like you can't even function normally. But I eventually got a diagnosis of panic disorder. I got put on medicine for it. I went to years and years of counseling and cognitive behavioral therapy. And also at that time, the self-help world was coming to fruition. And I just absorbed every single thing that I could read. And so I always tell people that I know without a doubt that struggle in my life, that can still at times be a struggle in other forms, is the very thing that led me to where I am today. And while, not everybody in my crowd has panic disorder, what I do know is that every person sitting in those seats has had something really difficult that they've had to overcome. They've had a trauma, a challenge, and adversity. And we don't talk about the hard stuff enough. And that's actually the thing that connects us. And so that story is important because it is what led me to doing the work to help others really be able to step into their potential, but also to create their happiness from the inside out.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that backstory. I mean, I'm thinking so many things right now. I love the point that you made earlier about a lot of times our hardest things, the most difficult, they are the things that unite us. but many times the hardest things that we have become our mission in life. And I really commend you for going through such a tough thing. But then now I was going to say on the backside of it, but I know I know it's still something that you deal with, right? But as you've come through to a brighter part of the other side, turning around and using that to help others, whether that be in education or in the business world. And we all have gone through those difficult times, but some jobs are innately more stressful than other jobs as well, right? That might trigger more difficulty in this area. And teaching, while it is, or working in education in general, while we know it is a calling, and or we feel like it is, and it's it's work that is worthy of doing and doing at a high level. It really is a stressful job. It's a difficult job to do.
Yeah. My primary physician years ago said, Kim, the number one reason I see people is for the common cold. The number two reason is to treat anxiety and stress. And he said, who do you think my number one clients are? And it was those in education.
Yeah.
I do think, this job, while we understand that it's the most noble, sacred profession out there, we are also all driving to our school buildings every day, and we're walking down the halls with smiles on our faces, but many of us are silently suffering. And we don't know how to get off that hamster wheel. I always tell people that, I don't do fluff. And the thing is, I think the education system is completely out of control. And I'd like to think that there's hope in that. But the bottom line is that we may not ever be able to control the system. And I don't even want to focus on that. I want to focus on what we can control, which is how we, as educators, how we operate in the system. So you are the only one who you can control. You are the only one that is responsible for how we navigate this. And that's what I like to focus on, because that's where the power really lies.
Yeah, I totally agree. So let's talk a little bit about, as we're all, as we're starting to understand this topic a little bit more. Give us the 30,000-foot view. What are some of the keys to the science of happiness, or the keys to unlocking that potential for happiness within ourselves?
Yeah, so the research is really astounding. What it says is that we all have a baseline happiness level. So maybe my baseline happiness level might be at a certain level, and maybe your baseline, David, is a little bit higher than mine. And so what this means is that good things can happen in our life. Like, maybe we get a new job or a new home, or we get married, or our kid gets into the best college, or whatever. We experience something. We go shopping for the day, and our happiness level goes up for a period of time. But what we know is that it always resets back to baseline. It might reset in 2 hours, 2 weeks, 2 months, but it's always going to come back to whatever your baseline is. Now, what's really interesting is the same is true for when we endure really hard things. The research shows over and over again that as human beings, we can endure loss, illness, trauma, tragedy, and our happiness levels will dip. But for most of us, after a period of time, we return to baseline. Now, if you're like me, you fight a little bit with the research. I'm kind of like, I don't know. I feel like there's some things that if those things had happened to me, I might not ever reclaim my happiness. But you and me probably both know, you and I know people who have endured the unimaginable, and they go on to live joy-filled, meaning-filled lives. Yeah. So then everybody goes, well, where's baseline come from? Why is Kim's lower than David's and Samantha's is higher, And so I always tell people to picture your happiness as a pie chart. And here's what we know. We know that 50% of your long-term happiness is genetic. It comes from your mom or your dad, or a mixture of both. And David, it never fails. I look out into the crowd, and 80% of the people hang their heads and think, I'm so screwed. I'm like, oh, it's just 50%, but it's so funny. You could just see some of them just shaking their heads, But it's true. There, it's like the same reason that some of us can look at a McDonald's French fry and put on 10 pounds, and some of us can eat McDonald's French fries. It's just there's this genetic tendency to it. So then I think it gets really interesting, because what the research says is that I can take every single experience, circumstance that you've ever had, whether it's how you grew up, what your income levels were. I can take every single thing and throw it together. And those external circumstances only account for 10% of long-term happiness.
Wow, is that right?
Yeah. And so everybody's like, oh yeah, right. Well, here's the deal. Here's what we know. We know that obviously certain circumstances are going to still more than 10% for a while, right?
Mhm.
But what we know is that it's really only in the long term 10%, because we have the ability to bounce back to our baseline. And so it doesn't matter if you're married, single, divorced, or widowed, if you have kids, if you don't have kids, what kind of car you drive, what kind of money you make, like all of those things can be thrown together. The problem is that we're human beings. And if you're like Kim Strobel, you sometimes let things steal way more than 10% of the pie for way too long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, but that is so encouraging though, to know that all the things that are happening as far as your long-term happiness just account for a very small percentage.
It's a wake-up call. This is what I tell people. I'm a coach. I'm going to tell you hard things. The bottom line is bad things, unfair things do happen to us, and we are going to go in the gutter. My issue is you stay in the gutter too long, and that's on you. So at some point, we all have to get out of victim mode and into warrior mode. And I always tell people you have to take 100% responsibility for your life. And I think it's really easy. And again, I'm not saying I'm perfect at this. My goodness, I've had to work on this. I've let some people steal my joy for years and years because I ruminate on something they've done to me, And so this is a work that we're always doing, but people are kind of astounded, like, wow, maybe I need to rethink this a little bit.
Mhm. Well, I can totally see that.
Yeah.
So let me ask a specific question. On Advantage, we have some business folks and others who listen, and we're happy that they listen. But we mostly have educators and a lot of educational leaders, district administrators, school administrators. So when it comes, and I know you talk to educators a lot, when it comes to taking care of ourselves and being in warrior mode versus victim mode, are there any specific things that you say to educators and particularly educational leaders about those things?
Yeah, well, that's kind of where we get into the rest of the pie. Is if 50% is genetic and 10% is our external circumstances, then that leaves 40% of the pie left. And what we know is that every human being has the ability to increase their happiness and well-being levels by up to 40%. And it has to do with these three things. Number one, your thoughts. What are the thoughts that you're thinking over and over and over again? Two, what are your behaviors? And three, what are your actions? And so those, I could talk all day long on that 40%. But when I'm talking to school leaders too, a lot of times it's like, how do we get those teachers out of the gutter, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, I'll just be honest. It's really easy to play victim in this system because gosh darn it, we have been mistreated. We really have. And our pay doesn't reflect the value that we bring. And so I am not saying that we ignore those things, but at the same time, we have to ask ourselves, how do I want to feel on a daily basis? And are my actions, thoughts, and behaviors aligned to the goal of how I want to feel? And so the other thing that I think is important, because we're all working, and school leaders, I mean, I sometimes feel like they're like the middle child or the stepchild. We do put a lot of focus on teacher well-being and taking care of our teachers. And then, you have the superintendent's office and the board of education, but like school administrators kind of fall in the middle. It's like sometimes they're left just to figure things out on their own. And so they're trying to take care of the massive amount of responsibility that they have, but then they are also holding, the trauma of the children that are in their school and the teacher trauma and teacher retention and all of this stuff that goes into it. And so I really do feel like there's not supportive pieces in place sometimes for them. And I think we have to really learn how to do that. And one of I always tell people, the formula that we've all been fed is, if you want to be happy in life, here's what you do. You go to school, you work really hard, you get good grades. You get really good grades so you can get into a good college. Once you get into a good college, now you really have to buckle down because you're competing with so many. So work even harder, get the good transcript, get the really good job, climb the ladder of success, jump through all these hoops. And when you've jumped through all of these hoops, now you've arrived at happiness. And that is a social construct that has been passed down from generations of well-meaning parents and caretakers and teachers. But all of the research in the last 20 years is showing that that formula for success is actually completely backwards. What we know is that when I can teach you to put your happiness at the forefront, when I can teach you to make your happiness a priority, we then begin to get leverage in every single area of your life. So it's actually happiness that when we have that as a priority, we begin to see the lever move in the other parts of our life. And I'm going to give you some really good stats about that. Okay. So when I can get your brain to positive, or your employees' brains to positive, when I can teach them specific habits to retrain their brain towards positive, and I'm not talking toxic positivity, because I can't stand toxic positivity. Like, we got to quit telling people, when they say they're stressed or they're disappointed or they're frustrated, and we say things to people like, now sweetheart, just count your blessings, just be thankful you've got a job, and like, can't stand that. Like, we're allowed to have our hard feelings, so I'm not talking about rushing our hard feelings away. I'm saying we acknowledge those, but then how do we pivot those to actually get us to where we're going? And so when I can get your brain to positive versus negative, neutral, or stressed, here's what happens. You are 31% more productive. 31% more productive. When I can get your brain to positive, you are 10 times more engaged in your job. Can you imagine, David, being 10 times, or your teachers being 10 times more engaged in your job? Not only are you 31% more productive and 10 times more engaged in your job, but you are 3 times more creative, which means that all of a sudden you can see solutions to problems that you couldn't see before. Because when your brain is at stressed, you don't have accessibility to certain parts of your brain. And so when we lead and teach happiness and well-being, it actually affects the bottom line, and we begin to change every single business and educational outcome.
Man, that is awesome. Now my mind is reeling. I'm just thinking about, okay, so I was going to ask you about high achievers, and I think that's that's yes. Part of what you're addressing there. Those people that follow that traditional formula, and whatever situation you put them in, they figure out how to kind of rise to the top. We try to hire those people, but at the same time, what a revolutionary thought, that instead of, those high achievers also a lot of times are carrying a lot of weight and a lot of pressure just to achieve, to rise to the top and whatever. And that can become kind of a toxic thing if you don't watch. Toxic on yourself, can be toxic with others, depending on how you approach climbing that ladder, or we talk on here a lot about being competitive, and being competitive is a good thing if you're competing to better kids' lives, but it's not a good thing if it's cutthroat, and that it's that toxic way of trying to achieve.
It is. I always say that we wear our burnout as like a badge of honor, or we like slump away from the office and we only feel good about ourselves if like everything has been beat out of us for the day and there's nothing else to give. Then we kind of like pat ourselves on the back and go, yeah, I'm a really good human. I worked really hard today. But at the same time, people are saying, I want to feel different in my life. And so I get it, because I'm a very ambitious person. And I think it's something that I'm trying to follow my ambition in a way that lights me up on the inside and doesn't necessarily do it for the accolades, but it's hard at times. And here's what we do. We play what I call the if-win game with happiness. We say, when I achieve this goal, I will be happy. Or when I lose this weight, I'll be happy. Or when I can get this job, I'll be happy. And the problem with that is, one, you're sacrificing your happiness in the now because you're tying it to the achievement of a goal. Yes. The other thing that people don't realize, and this is why it's an addiction, you said it, it's a total addiction, is because what we know about the human brain, David, is that we have hedonic adaptation. It's a natural mechanism of our brain. And what that is like, on a really cold, blustery day when you're freezing and you come in and you sit by the fire and that fire feels amazing. But after about a minute or two, it just doesn't feel as good. So you move away from the fire. Mm-hmm. Well, that's called hedonic adaptation. We are biologically born with it, which means our body will adapt. So what happens is let's say that you have a goal of whatever, making this much money or whatever it might be. Maybe like for me, I'm writing my book, right? Oh, if I could just write that book. So you write the book, or you attain that goal, or you lose that weight. And what the research shows is that happiness doesn't last, because all you do is change the goalpost. Right. Now you say, you know what? In order to, 20 pounds isn't enough. If I'm really going to be happy, I need to lose 25. Mm-hmm. Or, okay, I attained that goal, but now I got to get the dopamine hit again. So my brain needs to go even further. And so what I want people to do is be big and audacious and go after every grain of potential that you have, but make sure it's aligned to your insides and not to these outside things.
Yeah, it makes me think about, what you're describing is drawing your happiness from the results versus drawing your happiness from the journey. You mentioned, when I lose 10 pounds, I'll be happy, versus I'm happy. And while I'm happy, because I'm happy, I'm going to spend some time working on my nutrition, and it just a simple mindset change, right?
That's actually magic. What you just said right there is that people are constantly delaying it. And if they would work on their happiness right now, that's why it begins to be a lever changer. It really is, because like you get your mind in a positive mindset, and now all of a sudden you're making different decisions, you're choosing different behaviors, you're taking different actions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned three things: your thoughts. This is the 40% you control: your thoughts, your behaviors, and your actions. So what we're talking about here is changing your thoughts. It's changing the way you approach things, the way that you view life, which starts with I'm happy, I'm content. And because of those things, because I feel that way, I can work on improvement in these areas and enjoy the progress that I make along the way, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I've got a couple of strategies I'd love to share that will help your people work on that 40%.
I was about to ask. That's great.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is, because I have a feeling that people who are in leadership many times, and even educators, they're quite ambitious people. I mean, this is just not a job to be taken lightly. It's just like, it's a fire inside of us. And, I always say, we know it's super hard, but my gosh, we're still showing up and we're doing it, And so one of the things that I teach people is the minimum effective dosage, which is, you can boil water. And trust me, David, you can tell by watching me, I don't like to do anything minimally. It's just not in my nature. But I will say this concept is so backed by research that I have begun to implement it in my own life. And so you can boil water at 212 degrees, but you can also boil it at 256 or 272. And when you put the noodles in, if you boil it at 212 versus 259, The only difference is that the noodles are kind of loosey goosey, right? They actually get worse. But it's not like, you put noodles in and out pops a chocolate cake, right? So we're burning it. I mean, I always tell people in the education world, we're burning it at 256 or 272. And when we get stressed, we say, I just got to stay a little bit longer. I just got to finish this. I just got to keep going, And here's what the research says. It goes back to the fact that when your brain's at positive, you're 31% more productive, because the research shows that after you put in about 50 hours of work, that for the average human, that's about 37 hours of useful work. Okay. So 50 hours generates about 37. Look what happens when you say, I just need to put 5 more hours in. I just need to keep going a little bit more. When you go to 55 hours, you only produce 30 hours of work. So you've put in an extra 5 hours just to lose 7.
Wow.
And some of us are like, that's not true. That's not true. Look, there are times when I'm still trying to pull 60 or 70-hour work weeks. Every now and then I get sucked back in. And, was it last week or the week before, I was like working at 8:30 at night. And David, I will tell you, I was working, but about every 5 minutes I'd be like, oh, well, let's click on Instagram and see what's going on. And then I'd be like, Kim, get it back together. And I'd work a little bit longer. Next thing you know, I'm shopping online. It's because the brain is fatigued. And so that, sometimes people are just kind of blown away from that. But I will challenge people. I challenge you to see what happens when you figure out how to back off just a little.
Yeah, yes. And so I'm following the flow chart here. The flow chart is, if I can find that optimal zone of effectiveness, not overdoing it. I was thinking about, over the weekend, I visited with my mom and dad, and my dad he's one of those high achievers, good at everything, and he's really good with his hands. He can build things and put things together. But because he's so competitive and such a high achiever, he's the guy that when he's putting a screw in, he has to turn it that one last time. And sometimes that one last time breaks the screw or breaks the piece. He's like notorious in our family for that. And so what you're talking about is stop before you turn that screw the one last time.
Analogy, yes. And I call it the sweet spot, right? Like you said, like that zone of where I'm highly productive, I'm highly engaged. And then I always ask people, you know what? I want you to ask this question to yourself. Let's say you put in an extra 5 or 10 or 15 hours a week. My question to you is going to be, how much more effective are you as a leader? Because if you like spread your hands far apart and you say, oh, Kim, when I put in 60, 65 hours, 70 hours a week, I'm this much more effective, then I'm going to say, okay, well, you're an anomaly and keep doing it. But when you say I'm this much more effective, when it's just a small amount, which I don't even think you probably are, I'm going to have you ask yourself, is it worth it? Is it worth it to be that much more effective when you think about everything you're losing when it comes to your family, your children, your own mental health, your playtime, time, is it worth it? And sometimes people never really thought of it that way. Is it worth it? Because I know that when I was working in a school, doing some professional development years ago, there was a retired teacher who was volunteering at the school. She said, Kim, I know you're out talking to all kinds of educators. And she said, if there's one thing I would tell them, get home to your family. Because she said, I worked till 6 o'clock every night. And I would do it differently now. As a woman who has this wisdom, tell them, get home, have a family life. You are more than an educator. You are. That's a great, grand, noble profession, but you're allowed to be the other things in your life too.
Yeah, and even from a productivity standpoint, even, we're talking about work-life balance and the fact that those things are important. They're important because they allow you to find happiness. And when you do, and your brain has time to rest, it's not saturated and overloaded. Well, you already gave us the stats. You're 10 times more engaged. You're 3 times more creative. You're 31% more effective. So you're trying to find that sweet spot, because you get the compound effect of all of that creativity, you actually become more productive in the long run. Plus, you have time with your family, and you're attending to your fitness or your faith or whatever it is that you need to
That's right.
spend that you spend more time on.
David, they just did a massive study over in Britain. Now, this is going to make people lose their minds when I say this, but they did a massive study in the corporate world where they paid corporations money to be a part of a study where they took their employees down to 4 days a week. Okay. And they monitored for 2 years what happened. And in almost every single facet, their sales increased, the productivity levels of their employees increased. They produced more in 4 days than they did 5. Now, I would like to think at some point in this, lifetime, I don't know that we'll get there, but I really think we have to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll tell a little personal story. I actually have a personal anecdote that I think illustrates the research. So in my former job, which I loved, I was assistant superintendent. I was the chief academic officer in Boyle County Schools in Kentucky. Love that job. Having said that, I was the guy you're talking about. I was working 45, 50, 55 hours a week and just, always just churning and working and doing. And because of that, it was a pretty stressful job. Now, I put a lot of that stress on myself, but be that as it may, very stressful. So in the summer, in Kentucky, we have a 2 week period in the summer called the dead period for athletics. And my kids were in athletics, and a lot of people in our school district's kids were in athletics. So we started to take those 2 weeks off. We would all organize our calendars so that we could take the 2 weeks off. And if you wanted to, go on vacation or whatever, your kids weren't playing sports then, so they weren't missing practice. And so I got to where I would take 2 weeks off in a row. Well, what I noticed was for the entire, let's say we would go to Florida. My mother and father-in-law have a place in a little retirement community in Florida. So we would go to Florida, and for the first week, now given I love education and I love leadership, like my brain likes to think about education and leadership. I would go to Florida, and for the first week, even up to 7 or I mean, even up to 8 or 10 days, my brain literally would not think about education. Like I was in Florida and I couldn't, if I thought about it, it stressed me out. On about day 11, I would find my mind drifting to education, and it wasn't making me feel tired. And so that told me that my brain was rested and I was ready. I was ready to go back. And so I was only doing that once a year. so,
Right.
so what we're saying is, if I could go back, I needed to find a way to do that, to let my brain have that rest on a consistent basis. There's no doubt I would have been more productive, because at the end of that second week, I came back and I was more productive. I was probably better in the month of July and August than I maybe was the rest of the year.
Yeah, it matches exactly what the research says. And so I do think that we have to give ourselves permission, and we have to understand, especially when you are a high achiever, that you are no less valuable than, like if I decide, I'm going to stop working at 2 o'clock today or whatever, I'm not a less valuable human being because I chose to do that. And we have to really start celebrating, I think, the people that do that as well. I tell school principals all the time, don't celebrate one time I was at a school, and on Fridays they celebrate a teacher, and they're like, oh, Mrs. Lyons, she's the teacher of the week. That woman, she's here every night till 6 o'clock. Her car's here on Saturday mornings. And I'm like, no, we are not celebrating that. We're celebrating Mr. Smith, who knows he's more than a teacher and gets out of here every day at 4 o'clock. Everybody clap for him, So we have to be really careful what we're praising as well, because we praise burnout.
We do. Kim, if I'm going to start this journey, if I'm a listener to the podcast today, and speaking to me personally as well, if I'm going to start this journey, what are the first 2 or 3 things I should think about tomorrow?
Okay, well, there's one more little happiness habit that I really want to teach you, because it's a 2-minute practice and it is a game changer, and it works on that 40%. It's a word we're all very familiar with, but I really want to break it down. So what we know is that the practice of daily gratitude falls in the top 5 happiness habits. Now, I know your people are going to want the top 5, so I'm going to give them to you really quickly, but I'm only going to go deep on the gratitude one, okay? So the top 5 are gratitude, move your body 30 minutes a day, social connections, so tend to the relationships, random acts of kindness, believe it or not,
Love it.
and meditation. Those are the top 5. So what we know is that if I can get you to write down 3 different things that you're thankful for every single day, after 21 days, I create a new neural feedback loop in your brain. And when we create that new neural feedback loop, your brain starts to scan its environment and it starts to notice more good than bad. And that causes that compound ripple effect in your life. Now, sometimes people are like, oh, I don't know, da 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 da. Well, Oprah preached this for like 15 years before I started to do it, but I'm somebody who has to really know why it works. So I want to tell you why it works. We know that the average human being has 70,000 thoughts a day. 70,000. And you're like, there's no way. Well, that's because the majority of them are happening in your subconscious mind, and they're in the background playing so fast every single day that you're just not even aware of them. And what we also know is that if you're an average human being, that 80% of your thoughts in a day's time are negative.
Wow.
Which means when most of us put our head on the pillow at night, we've had 56,000 negative thoughts that day. Now, some people are like, not me, not me. I'm like, oh, really? Well, let me take you back to your alarm going off this morning. Because some of you, your alarm went off and you immediately went, I didn't get any sleep last night. And then you got up and you started walking and you were complaining about your back. And then it's like sometimes we've had 62 negative thoughts before we hit the shower. We don't even know it, and David's laughing hysterically here on the other side of the screen. You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
I totally do. I think I'm guilty of that.
Interesting is that up to 80% of thoughts that are negative, 95% of the 80 are the exact same thoughts you had the day before.
Wow.
Now, why are we wired to negativity? Well, here's why. Because we have this part of our brain called the amygdala, and the amygdala is the very thing that saved us in caveman times. The amygdala has one job, and its job is to scan its environment for negativity or danger in order to protect us, to keep us safe. And back then, you had to be on high alert. You had to know, is there a saber-toothed tiger? Will we be killed by this clan? Do we have a water source? Do we have shelter? The issue is it's 2023 and we still have amygdalas, and their number one job is still to scan for negativity. We can rewire that by a 2-minute daily gratitude practice. And I tell people your brain has thousands and thousands of roadways, and whichever roadway you travel the most gets more and more ingrained. So if I'm going to think about the stress of my job, and that's pinging in my brain 628 times a day, tomorrow it's going to ping in my brain 675 times, because that just gets deeper and deeper. What we actually know we can do is we can divert that. We can create new neural pathways that ping your brain to start noticing the good. And when we do that, we get you to optimistic. And when we do that, we get your brain to positive, where the negative, neutral, or stressed, and things begin to shift. I'm going to give you one other pointer. So all I do is get a notebook, and every day I write the date, and then I do at the top, write the words, I am thankful, because those 3 words create a vibrational frequency about them. They're very, very powerful. So I write, I am thankful. And then you write 3 things. And I tell people, be specific. Don't say, I'm thankful for my health. Say, I'm thankful that my legs allow me to run 40 miles a week, right? That's what, my body does for me. Don't just say, I'm thankful for my family. Say, I'm thankful that on Thursday nights we have a pizza date with my parents. So be a little specific, but it's literally a 2-minute practice. I tell people, they always tell me, Kim, I cannot believe how much this has changed my life.
Man, that is fantastic. I love it.
Yeah.
So those three things, your thoughts, your behaviors, and your actions. What I'm hearing from you today is if I start this journey tomorrow, I'm starting with my thoughts, right?
You are.
I'm starting with finding that optimal sweet spot for efficiency so that my brain can be more productive and it can rest and I can spend time with family and enjoy that. We're talking about daily gratitude, which creates new neural pathways. So I'm starting with my thoughts, and I'm going to assume then that leads to my behaviors and my actions, right?
It absolutely does. That is the hierarchy.
That is fantastic. Kim, tell me about this. Is important work. It really is important. It's important beyond education, but I love it that our listeners are getting to learn a little bit more about it today. You are deeply entrenched in it. What motivates you? I know you've touched on it, but what motivates you every day to dig more deeply and to spend more time on this?
I really think that, I don't want to sound like I have this perfect life, but because, David, I have really truly known such darkness and suffering at times in my life, I just don't take things for granted. I really don't. Like, it sounds silly, but every morning I wake up and my first thought is today's going to be a great day, and then I go out and I get my gratitude journal and I sit out on my deck and I watch the, sunrise, and I do my gratitudes. I think that I see this life as such a gift, and I have done the work on myself, and I know that that every human being has that capability to reach down within themselves and to what I call create a life from the inside out. And so, like, last week when I spoke to 2,500 school leaders in Texas, my Instagram was lit up with messages of like, Kim, I so needed this message, or you said this and I feel less alone. And when people, it's those little tiny small things when I know, okay, I've helped someone who maybe felt a little lost or felt like they were alone or felt hopelessness. I mean, it just fires me up because I feel like when I can affect leaders and teachers, they are directly affecting our student,
Mhm.
and so I just think that maybe I had to go through all the hard stuff because it's the very thing that helps me chase the light now.
Yeah, and we all got in this profession for kids. We all have a heart for kids, and if you can directly or indirectly better the life of a child, then that's what makes us go, right? That's what motivates us each day. And gosh, you're doing great work. Kim, how can our listeners find out more about you or learn more from you?
Yeah. Well, they can go to just strobeleducation.com and they can see any workshops that we're providing, my keynotes, different things like that. And I'm going to send you, David, we have a gratitude prompt and tracker that they could get if they wanted to download that gives them like 5 areas to start looking for gratitude in their life, just so they can kind of get the swing of it. And I'll drop the link over to you in an email. And if you want to put that in your show notes or whatever, some of them might want to download that.
I will definitely do that. Kim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I knew this would be a super easy interview with you. It's nice to just be able to have conversation back and forth.
Well, I agree. I really enjoyed it. I knew I would, and it was as good a conversation as I knew it would be.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's going to do it for another episode of Advantage. Thanks again to Kim Strobel for joining us today, and thanks to our listeners as well. Hope everyone has a great week, and we will see you next week with a new episode. Take care.